The mountains never gave them back. 17 children vanished from remote villages across the Carpathian Range between 1987 and 1992. No bodies were recovered, no ransom demands were made. The authorities filed reports, conducted searches, and eventually closed the cases as unsolved disappearances. But the villagers knew something else was happening. They had seen the patterns before, generations earlier, when their own ancestors spoke of children who walked into the forests and simply ceased to exist. I first learned about this while researching something completely unrelated. A footnote in a Romanian anthropology journal mentioned unusual folklore surrounding child disappearances in mountainous regions. The academic dismissed it as superstition masking tragic accidents. But the footnote included coordinates for 3 villages. I visited them last autumn. What I found wasn't folklore. The village of Sasel sits in a valley so remote that cell service didn't reach it until 2019. 43 people live there now. In 1989, there were 62. The difference isn't explained by migration or natural deaths. 5 children disappeared that year alone, all between the ages of 7 and 11. All within a 3-month period, all from families who had lived in these mountains for centuries. Elena Codreanu was 12 when her brother vanished. She's 51 now, still living in the same house where she grew up. Her hands shook when she poured the tsueka, traditional plum brandy that loosened memories she'd spent decades trying to bury. Andrei went to check the sheep, she said in Romanian, her voice barely above a whisper. It was 2 in the afternoon. Sun was bright. He took the dog. The dog came back 3 hours later, alone, whining at the door. Andrei never did. The search party found the sheep grazing peacefully in their usual meadow. They found Andrei's walking stick leaned carefully against a tree, as if he'd placed it there intentionally. They found his cap folded neatly on a flat rock. But they never found Andrei. The police said he fell into a ravine, Eleanor continued, but they never found a body, and they never explained why he would fold his cap and leave his stick behind before falling. This detail repeats across every case I investigated. Personal belongings left in deliberate arrangements, shoes placed side by side, jackets hung on branches, water bottles set upright on stones. These weren't the chaotic scenes of accidents or abductions. They were organised, intentional, as if the children had prepared for something. The local priest refused to speak with me at first. Father Vasile had been serving Sechel since 1985, which meant he'd been there for all 5 disappearances. He'd performed the funeral masses for children whose bodies were never recovered. Blessed empty coffins that families buried to have something to mourn over. When I finally convinced him to talk, he did so only after ensuring we were alone in the church. "You want to know what the old people say?" he asked, lighting candles beneath an icon of St. Nicholas. "They say the mountains are hungry, that every generation they take their tribute. The children don't die, they become something else, something." I expected him to dismiss this as peasant superstition. Instead, he pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "This belonged to my predecessor, Father Iowan. He kept records of everything unusual in the parish. Read the entry from September 1954. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. Father Iowan had documented 3 disappearances that year, all following the same pattern. But he'd added something else. Testimonies from villagers who claimed to have seen the missing children months after they vanished. Not as corpses, not as ghosts, but changed somehow. Standing at the tree line at dawn, watching the village from distant ridges, always silent, always alone, always retreating deeper into the mountains when anyone approached. "You think I'm insane for showing you this," Father Vasile said. "I thought Father Iowan was losing his mind when I first read it. Then I saw one myself." He described an evening in 1991, 2 years after Andrei Codreanu disappeared. He'd been hiking to a neighbouring village, taking a shortcut through the forest. At sunset, he'd spotted a figure on an outcropping above the path. A boy, wearing clothes that were outdated by decades but somehow pristine. The boy had watched him for perhaps 30 seconds before turning and walking into the forest with a gait that wasn't quite right, too fluid, too purposeful. "I convinced myself I'd imagined it," Father Vasile said, until I mentioned it to Elena's grandmother. She went white. made the sign of the cross 3 times, asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen. When I finished, she showed me a photograph. It was Andrei. Same face, same build. But the photograph was taken in 1989, and I'd seen this boy in 1991. The pattern extends far beyond Sicel. I found similar cases in 7 other villages across the Carpathians. The dates vary, the details differ slightly, but the core remains consistent. Children disappear near forests, their belongings are found arranged deliberately. Search parties find nothing. And sometimes, years later, someone glimpses a figure that resembles the missing child, unchanged by time, standing at the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The Romanian authorities have no unified explanation. Individual case files cite different causes: animal attacks, kidnapping, accidental death, drowning, exposure. But when you map the disappearances, a geographic pattern emerges. They cluster around specific mountain peaks, areas where the forest is oldest, where archaeological surveys have found evidence of settlements dating back millennia, where the local dialect still contains words that linguists can't trace to any known language family. I spent 3 weeks hiking these mountains, camping near the sites where children were last seen. The forest feels different there, not threatening exactly, but aware, like something is paying attention. On my 8th night, camped near the spot where Andrei Codreanu's cap was found, I woke at 3 a.m. to complete silence. No wind, no animal sounds, no insects, just absolute stillness. And in that stillness, I heard singing. A child's voice, distant but clear, echoing through the trees with a melody I'd never heard before but somehow recognized. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds before fading. I didn't search for the source. Some instinct I can't explain told me that would be a mistake. The next morning I found fresh footprints near my tent, small, barefoot, leading deeper into the forest before vanishing at the base of an ancient oak tree. What happens to the children who walk into these mountains? Where do they go? And why do they sometimes return, change into something that wears their face but moves through the world differently than any human should? The villagers have theories. Most involve old gods, pre-Christian entities that supposedly inhabited these mountains before Rome conquered Dacia, beings that the forests remember even if humanity has forgotten. But theories don't explain the physical evidence, the arranged belongings, the sightings, the footprints that appear and disappear without logical explanation. The physical evidence is what haunts me most. On my 11th day in the mountains, I met Dr. Adrian Popescu, a forensic anthropologist from Cluj who'd been quietly investigating these cases for 6 years. He keeps his research private, fearing academic ridicule. But his findings are impossible to dismiss. The arrangements, he told me over coffee in his cluttered university office, follow mathematical patterns. Not random, not the work of animals or opportunistic criminals. He spread photographs across his desk. Andrei's cap and compass, Elena's shoes and doll, items from 17 other cases, all photographed exactly as found. Look at the spacing, the angles. These objects are positioned according to geometric principles that predate modern mathematics. He pulled out a map marked with coloured pins. Every arrangement aligns with astronomical phenomena. Solstices, equinoxes, specific star positions visible only from those exact locations. His finger traced lines connecting the pins. And the dates matter. These disappearances cluster around transition periods, times when ancient calendars marked boundaries between seasons, between worlds. I asked the obvious question, what about the children themselves? What happens to their bodies? Dr. Popescu's expression darkened. That's what troubles me most. In comparable cases, missing children in other regions, we find remains within months. Animals scatter bones. Weather exposes burial sites. But here, nothing. No bones, no fabric remnants, no biological trace after the initial scene. It's as if they're removed from the physical world entirely. He showed me soil samples taken from disappearance sites. Standard analysis reveals nothing unusual. But spectroscopy shows trace elements that shouldn't exist in these concentrations. Rare earth metals, isotopes that suggest exposure to radiation, except there's no radiation source within 200 kilometres. His hands shook slightly as he handled the reports. One sample contained pollen from a plant species that's been extinct for 3,000 years. The scientific impossibilities multiply when you examine the sighting reports. Father Vasile wasn't the only one to see Andrei after his disappearance. I tracked down 5 other witnesses across 8 years. A postal worker in 1993, 2 hikers in 1997, a logging crew supervisor in 2001, a shepherdess in 2004. All describe the same boy, wearing the same clothes, appearing at forest boundaries during twilight hours. He didn't look lost, the shepherdess Maria Ionescu told me. He looked like he was waiting, standing perfectly still, watching the village below. I called out to him, asked if he needed help. He turned his head very slowly and looked directly at me. His eyes were wrong. How were they wrong? She struggled with the description. Too clear, like coloured glass, and he didn't blink. Just stared for maybe 10 seconds, then walked backward into the trees, not turning around. Walking backward. His feet barely touched the ground. The most disturbing account came from Elena Radulescu's cousin, Christian, now 43. In 2008, 20 years after Elena vanished, he saw her standing outside his grandmother's house at dawn. I was taking out garbage. I looked up and she was there, on the road, exactly as I remembered her. 7 years old, same dress, same braids. She smiled at me. Then she pointed toward the mountains and mouthed something I couldn't hear. He paused, visibly shaken by the memory. I ran inside to wake my grandmother. When we came back out, Eleanor was gone, but there were wet footprints leading away from where she'd stood. Small, barefoot. They went halfway down the road and then just stopped. I photographed those footprints while researching Christian's account. He'd marked the spot with a stone. The road there is packed dirt, hard as concrete in summer. Yet, according to 3 neighbours who witnessed the aftermath, the prints were pressed deep into the surface, as if made by someone far heavier than a child. And the moisture tested positive for mountain spring water from an elevation 2,000 metres above the village. Water that couldn't naturally reach that location. These cases would be easier to dismiss if they existed in isolation, but the pattern extends beyond Romania. I found similar clusters in the Pyrenees, the Carpathian extensions into Ukraine, remote regions of the Balkans, always mountains, always ancient forests, always the same sequence: disappearance, arranged belongings, no remains, eventual sightings of unchanged children who don't quite move like human beings. A folklorist in Lviv showed me medieval manuscripts describing the taken ones, children who walked into sacred groves and returned as messengers for something the texts call the Old Authority. These accounts date back to the 14th century, written by monks attempting to document pagan practices that persisted despite Christianization. The descriptions match modern reports with uncomfortable precision. They walk between, one manuscript states, wearing the faces of the lost but speaking with voices that echo from stone and root. They are doorways, not children, markers of boundaries that were old when our grandfathers' grandfathers first cleared the forest. What boundaries? Between what and what? The manuscripts don't specify, but they warn against following these figures, against speaking to them, against accepting anything they offer. They will seem as kin, the text continues. They will wear beloved faces and speak with remembered voices. But they are not what they appear. They are invitations to cross thresholds that should remain uncrossed. I dismissed this as medieval superstition until my final week in Romania. I'd arranged to hike with a mountain rescue specialist, Radu Costin, who'd participated in searches for 3 missing children over 2 decades. We were documenting the area where Elena was last seen, taking GPS coordinates and soil samples, when Radu suddenly stopped walking. "There," he whispered, pointing up the slope. "Do you see?" I saw nothing at first, then movement. A small figure standing among the trees, perhaps 60 meters away, too distant for clear detail, but the size and posture suggested a child. The figure stood completely motionless, facing our direction. Radu's breathing had changed, shallow, rapid. We should go back. Why? I raised my camera, zooming in. Through the lens I could make out more detail. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, wearing what looked like a traditional Romanian dress, but the colours were too vivid, too saturated. She was staring directly at us with an intensity that registered even at this distance. I took 3 photographs. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the camera, just watched. Now, Radu said firmly. We're leaving now. Leaving. We descended rapidly, neither of us speaking until we reached his vehicle. Only then did I review the photographs on my camera's display. The first image showed the trees clearly. The second showed a blur of motion. The third showed nothing but forest. But in the second image, the blur suggested movement toward us. Impossibly fast. Radu drove in silence for 20 minutes before pulling over at a roadside shrine. He lit a candle, crossed himself 3 times, then turned to face me. You need to delete those photographs. I asked why. His jaw tightened. Because you've been noticed, and being noticed by them is not something you walk away from unchanged. He told me about his first search and rescue operation 17 years ago. A boy named Andrei, age 6, wandered from a family picnic. Standard procedure: establish a perimeter, work outward in expanding circles, call in additional teams if necessary. They found Andrei 4 hours later, sitting on a fallen log 2 kilometers from the picnic site. Unharmed, not even particularly frightened, but wrong. His parents knew immediately, Radu said. Before he spoke, before he moved, they knew. The boy's gait had changed, smoother, more deliberate. His speech patterns were different, more formal, as if translating from another language. He used words a 6-year-old shouldn't know. He described the forest in terms that suggested intimate familiarity with its deepest reaches. The mother refused to take him home. She screamed when the psychologist suggested family reunification. The father just stared at the boy and wept. What happened to Andrei? He disappeared from the hospital 3 days later, walked out during a shift change. Security footage shows him leaving, but... Radu paused. The footage also shows him still in his room, both things at once. The technicians thought it was a glitch. They never found him again, but Radu saw him twice over the following years. Once at the edge of a search grid for another missing child. Once standing on a mountain road at dawn, watching Radu's vehicle pass. Neither time did Andrei acknowledge Radu. He simply observed. Each time I saw him, another child went missing within 48 hours. I pressed for details. How could he be certain it was the same boy? Because he hadn't aged, not a day. Both sightings were years apart, but he looked identical. Same height, same clothes even, like someone had paused him. Back in Bucharest, I spent 3 days attempting to recover data from the corrupted photograph. Multiple software packages, professional recovery services. Nothing worked. The file wasn't merely corrupted, it had been overwritten with what the technician described as structured noise, patterns that shouldn't occur naturally in digital corruption. It's like something edited your file, he said, but that's not possible. Nothing accessed your camera except your computer. I focused on the other cases instead, cross-referencing disappearances with geographic data, weather patterns, lunar phases, searching for variables that might explain the clustering. The work was methodical, grounding. It let me avoid thinking about what I'd seen on that mountainside. Then I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line. The message contained a single sentence. Ask about the Scholomance. The Scholomance appears in Romanian folklore as a legendary school run by the devil himself, hidden in the mountains where chosen students learn the secrets of nature and magic. Most scholars dismiss it as myth, a cautionary tale about forbidden knowledge. But the email had come from an academic server at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca. I traced it to Professor Emil Barbu, a folklore specialist who'd published extensively on Romanian mountain traditions. When I called, he seemed to be expecting me. "You've been asking questions about the missing children. People talk. The villages have networks you don't see." He invited me to visit his office. 3 days later, I sat across from him in a cramped room lined with texts I couldn't read, most in Old Romanian or languages I didn't recognize. "The scholomance," he began, "is not what the tourist books describe. The real tradition is older, much older, pre-Christian, possibly pre-Roman." He pulled out a leather-bound manuscript, handling it with obvious reverence. "This was copied in the 17th century from earlier sources. It describes a practice, a exchange. Families would offer children to what it calls the mountain authority in return for protection, crop success, safety from invaders, the usual desperate bargains people make with forces they don't understand. But these weren't sacrifices. The children weren't killed. They were transformed, made into intermediaries, things that could exist in both the human world and whatever realm the mountain authority inhabited." The text uses a specific word, Streia, watchers. They marked boundaries. They observed. They reported back to something that couldn't enter our world directly. I asked the obvious question. Did he believe any of this was real? Professor Barbu closed the manuscript carefully. "I believe the tradition reflects something genuine, whether that something is a psychological phenomenon, a cultural practice we've forgotten how to interpret, or something else entirely." He shrugged. "I've interviewed dozens of families. The consistency is striking. These aren't people coordinating stories. They're geographically isolated, often don't know the other cases exist. Yet the details align. He documented 23 disappearances over 40 years that match the pattern. Children between 6 and 11. Always in mountainous regions above 1,500 metres. Always near old-growth forests. Always the same sequence. Sudden vanishing, organised belongings, eventual sightings. And there's something else. Something I've never published because it sounds absurd. What? The families that lose children this way? Their communities thrive. Better harvests, fewer accidents, lower mortality rates. It's statistically significant. I've checked. As if something is keeping its end of a bargain no one remembers making. He showed me spreadsheets, demographic data, agricultural yields. The correlation was undeniable. Villages with these disappearances showed measurably better outcomes across multiple metrics for years afterward. So you're suggesting these children are still being offered, unconsciously? I'm suggesting the mechanism never stopped. We just forgot we were part of it. The children aren't chosen by their families. They're chosen by something that recognises... what? Potential? Compatibility? I don't know. But once chosen, they go. And the community benefits. I thought about Elena. About her parents' strange calm, about how quickly the village seemed to accept her absence. "There's a woman," Professor Barbu said. "In a village called Valișoara. Her daughter was taken in 1991. She's the only parent I've found who talks openly about what happened. Most won't. But Mariana Popa will speak with you if you can reach her before winter closes the roads." He wrote down directions, coordinates, warnings about the route. She's seen her daughter since, multiple times, and she's learned things about what her daughter became. The road to Valișoara took 4 hours through deteriorating terrain. My rental car wasn't meant for mountain tracks that had seen better days when Rome still ruled these valleys. Twice I had to stop and clear fallen branches. Once I seriously considered turning back. Mariana Popa's house sat at the village edge, backed against forest that looked untouched since glaciers retreated. She was waiting on the porch when I arrived, as if she'd known I was coming. Maybe she had. In places this isolated, stranger arrivals don't go unnoticed. She was smaller than I expected, weathered in the way mountain people become, like the landscape itself has slowly claimed them. Her eyes were sharp, though, evaluating. "You're the American asking about children." Not a question. "Professor Babu suggested I speak with you." She nodded once. "Come inside. This isn't a conversation for open air." Her home was sparse but immaculate. Icons on every wall, but older than typical Orthodox imagery. Some of the figures didn't look entirely human. She caught me staring. "Protection," she said simply. "From what watches and from what serves what watches? Tea?" I accepted. She poured from a kettle that had been warming on an ancient stove, herbs I didn't recognize floating in the amber liquid. "My daughter's name was Anka. 8 years old when she left. That's the word I use now. Left. Not taken, not disappeared. She made a choice, even if she didn't understand it at the time." How did she know it was a choice? Because I saw her afterward 3 times. Each time she was different. Less like the child I'd raised, more like something wearing my daughter's face. But still her. Still aware. Still remembering me. Even if remembering didn't mean the same thing anymore. The first sighting came 6 months after Anka vanished. Mariana had been collecting mushrooms in the forest, nearly a kilometre from the village. She'd looked up to find her daughter standing at the tree line, absolutely motionless. She was naked, covered in mud and leaves like she'd been rolling in the forest floor, but she wasn't cold. It was October, freezing already at that altitude, and she stood there like temperature meant nothing. Her eyes were different, darker. Not the colour, the depth, like looking into wells that went down forever. Anka had spoken 3 words in Romanian. "I am watched." Then she turned and walked into the forest with a gait that wasn't quite right, joints bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. The second sighting was 2 years later, winter this time. Mariana had been walking home from a neighbour's house after dark. Anka had been sitting on a stone wall at the village boundary, completely still, snow accumulating on her shoulders and hair. She was older, not aged, but grown. Physically, she looked 12, maybe 13, but children don't grow that way, not evenly, not proportionally. She'd changed all at once, like something had decided she needed to be bigger and simply made it so. This time, Anka had said more, explained in a voice that sounded like wind through narrow spaces. That she was learning, that the mountain was teaching her to see properly, that humans lived in such small spaces, such limited dimensions, never understanding what existed in the gaps between their perceptions. I asked if she wanted to come home. She looked confused, like I'd asked if she wanted to become a chair. The concept didn't apply anymore. Home was a human idea. She'd moved past human ideas. The third encounter happened 5 years after that. Mariana had been gathering water from a spring that fed the village. Anka had been standing in the spring itself, water flowing around her legs, her reflection not quite matching her physical form. She'd aged again. Late teens now. Beautiful in a way that made Mariana's eyes hurt to perceive directly. Not human beauty, or something mathematics and symmetry couldn't quite capture. She told me the mountain has always needed watchers, that before humans built villages here, before Romans came, before anyone we'd call civilized, there were watchers. They mark territory, they maintain boundaries, they reported to something that exists in the spaces we don't have words for. And the children who become watchers, they're chosen for compatibility. Something in their nature resonates with whatever the mountain is. They don't die. They don't quite live either, not as we understand living. They exist in parallel, observing both worlds simultaneously, maintaining the barrier between them. Why maintain a barrier? Mariana's expression darkened. Because what's on the other side wants in, desperately, constantly, and if it ever manages to cross over completely, we wouldn't survive the encounter. Not as ourselves. We'd become something else, something that serves its purposes. The Watchers weren't protecting the mountain from humans. They were protecting humans from what lived in the mountain. Anka told me the bargain is ancient. older than any human civilization in these valleys. We give children who can be transformed. It gives us permission to exist here, to build, to farm, to live our small lives without being noticed by things that would regard us as we regard insects. Had she seen Anka since? Once more, last year, she came to the house, walked right up to the door. She looked 30 now, maybe older, ageless. Time doesn't touch them the same way. She told me the number of watchers is declining. Fewer children are compatible. Fewer families live in the old places where the barriers are thin. The mountain is losing its intermediaries. What happens if there aren't enough watchers? She didn't say directly, but she showed me something. Open my perception for just a moment. Let me see what she sees constantly. Mariana's hands trembled around her teacup. There are things in the mountains, old things, patient things. They press against reality like faces against glass. The watchers are the ones who ensure the glass doesn't break. Without them... She didn't finish. Didn't need to. I asked the question I'd been building towards since arriving. Did she regret what happened to Anksha? Mariana was quiet for a long time. Outside, the forest rustled with wind that didn't quite sound like wind. I miss my daughter. I miss who she would have become if she'd stayed human. But I understand now. We live here because something allows it, tolerates our presence. And the price of that tolerance is occasional transformation. Children who become something else, so the rest of us can remain ourselves. She walked me to the door as darkness fell, pointed toward the tree line. If you're very still, very quiet, sometimes you can see them, standing at the boundaries, watching, always watching. I looked, saw nothing but trees and shadow. Then the shadows moved, just slightly, in ways shadows shouldn't move. And I understood why parents don't search, why villages accept these losses, why Professor Barbu's statistics showed better outcomes for communities that lose children this way. Because the alternative is so much worse than losing a child. It's losing everything. I drove away from Valishwara as the last light died. My headlights caught something at the roadside. A small figure, standing perfectly still, watching my car pass with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. Some instincts are older than curiosity. The footage I shot remains on my hard drive mostly. The corrupted files I've learned to leave alone. The clear ones show mountains, villages, ordinary people living ordinary lives in places where ordinary ended centuries ago. Where bargains made before history began still bind communities to something they've forgotten how to name. Professor Barbu was right about the statistics. Villages lose children, then thrive. The correlation is undeniable once you know to look for it. But correlations don't explain mechanism, don't reveal what these communities are thriving under, what watches them from tree lines, what ensures their crops succeed and their accidents remain few. The parents I interviewed have made their peace with it. Some, like Mariana, understand explicitly. Others know only that grief eventually fades into acceptance, that life continues, that their remaining children seem somehow safer than children in neighbouring valleys where no one ever disappears. 3 months after returning home, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph, professional quality, showing me on that mountainside with Radu. In the background, barely visible among the trees, a small figure. The girl from my corrupted image, rendered perfectly clear. On the back, handwritten in careful script, "You were noticed. Be grateful you were allowed to leave." I haven't returned to Romania. Haven't pursued additional cases. Some research demands costs I'm not willing to pay. But sometimes, hiking familiar trails near my home, I catch movement at the edge of vision. Shadows that shift wrong, the sense of being observed by something that remembers my face and knows I've seen what I shouldn't have. The mountains keep their children, transform them into something between human and other, station them at boundaries most of us never perceive. And in exchange, we're permitted to exist, to build our villages, to raise our families, to pretend we're the dominant species in landscapes that tolerated our presence long before we learned to build fires. The disappeared children aren't gone. They're standing watch, making sure the glass doesn't break, maintaining barriers between our small, safe world and whatever presses against it from the other side. And sometimes, if you're very still, very quiet, at the edge of old forests where the trees remember when Rome was young, you can see them. Patient, eternal, wearing faces that were once human. Always watching, never blinking, keeping us safe from things we're blessed not to understand.